Mabuhay! Good afternoon from Manila. Welcome to Day 2 of RPC 21, the Manila Rotary Presidential Conference. I am Dieter Ocampo from the Rotary Club of Makati Circle of Friends, your MC for today. You're joining me online together with thousands of delegates from Asia Pacific and beyond here in beautiful, sunny, and vibrant Manila, Philippines. Together with the Rotarians and people of the Philippines, and our Rotary International President, Shekhar Mehta, I welcome you to Day 2 of RPC 21, the Manila Rotary Presidential Conference. Let's welcome our conference convener, Fast Rotary International Director, Rafi Garcia, as he will call to order the Day 2 of our conference.
As the convener of the Presidential Conference Manila, I hereby declare this second day open.
Thank you, Director Rafi. It is now time for the first of two arcs lined up today. You are now in the Environment for Good Arc. Through the Environmentalism for Good Arc, we recognize the complexity and interplay of the voices and debates on the state of the environment and what needs to be done. We seek to find the signal in the noise by learning from global climate practitioners and environmental thought leaders and advocates, and recognize that meaningful and sustainable climate progress can only be made through the convergence of all our actions, large and small. In this arc, we will hear from 3 keynote speakers altogether, and thereafter, you will move to any of the 5 simultaneously occurring breakout sessions. Thereafter, you will reconvene in plenary for the synthesis session. Our 3 keynote speakers for this arc are Dr. Oyun Sanjaasuren of the Green Climate Fund, joining us from South Korea. Dr. James Deutsch of the Rainforest Trust, joining us from the United States. And Dr. Janet Kabiberry Makaria of the United Nations Environment Program, joining us from Kenya. Coming up on stage is Dr. Oyun Sanjaasuren. Dr. Oyun is the Director of External Affairs of Green Climate Fund. She leads the group's work on resource mobilization, partnerships, communication, and advocacy. From the years 2014 to 2016, Dr. Oyun served as the first president of the United Nations Environment Assembly, the governing body of UN Environment. She is an active advocate for sustainable development, climate change, and water security. She served as a chair of the Global Water Partnership and is an advisory board member of the Future Earth. Formerly one of the leading politicians in Mongolia, she served as a member of parliament, Minister of Environment and Green Development, and Minister of Foreign Affairs. She is a founder of the Zorig Foundation, a leading Mongolian NGO that advocates democracy and supports youth leadership and education. Green Climate Fund is a South Korea-based financial institution mobilizing capital and resources to aid climate change initiatives in developing countries. Leaders of Asia Pacific, please welcome on stage Dr. Oyun Sanjaasuren.
Hello, a great pleasure to speak at the Rotarians Presidential Conference 21. Thank you very much for inviting me on behalf of the Green Climate Fund to speak at the conference. First of all, I would like to congratulate all of you Rotarians for doing a great and meaningful service for the betterment of the world. You have seen probably the Global Risks Report from the World Economic Forum that come out every year. And you may have also noticed that in the last few years, the global risks have been dominated more and more by climate-related, nature-related risks. That is inability to respond to climate change, natural disasters, extreme weather and biodiversity loss. And compared to a few years ago, which would be more sort of economical or traditional risks, now it is absolutely dominated by the climate change, by biodiversity loss, and by the nature-related crisis. Therefore, the current decade, 2020 to 2030, is crucial. It is a decade of nature and climate action. We need to halve the emissions by 2030 and halve again the decade after, and then reach net zero by 2050. Of course, there is also a need to reverse the biodiversity loss in the next decade. These are enormous tasks. It is also a disruptive decade with innovations and technologies. Just consider the scale of transformation required to limit dangerous warming. So this decade will also bring major opportunities and in a meaningful way. No longer we're questioning whether climate change is caused by human activities. The world is warmed by more than 1 degree Celsius, and we're already seeing that the climate change is running faster than we are. We have seen many disasters such as floods, fires, hurricanes, and the past decade was the hottest on record. This summer, 2021, was the hottest on the record. And then we don't want also, of course, to see those statistics coming further and further. If you look at the recent IPCC report, and that's Intergovernmental Commission on Climate Change, global temperature never exceeded the pre-industrial value by more than 2 degrees Celsius over the past 3 million years. Based on existing trends, we could cross the 2 degrees Celsius threshold at the very beginning of the second half of the century. The major momentum is being built, especially in the last 12 months, and political will is being created by the pledges of net zero from China, United States, European countries, Japan, Republic of Korea, where Green Climate Fund is headquartered, and 120 more countries. They equal now approximately 70% of the global economy and 65% of total emissions. This is a major breakthrough forward. At the same time, of course, we know that the pledges must now be translated into roadmaps to reach net zero, translated into concrete actions by enhanced commitments in COP26, which is coming in Glasgow in November. We're definitely seeing the public support growing, especially from the new generation. Let's remind ourselves, the top emitters are mostly from G20 countries. They actually constitute almost 80% of the emissions, of course, with the top emitters being China, United States, India, Russia, but also emerging countries like Indonesia. And the key emitting sectors are energy, buildings, transportation, industry. So we must make the major transition with those industries, in energy, of course, to renewables, including not only solar and wind, but also hydrogen and other alternative sources. We need to renovate our buildings with net zero carbon heating and cooling and move to building green buildings. New breakthroughs are also needed on low carbon cement, low carbon steel. Innovation will be key and critical to achieving these goals. 10 years from now, the level of innovation will explode. Huge investments in new technologies are being made or planned by governments and by private sector in the United States, Europe, China, and other major economies. The International Energy Agency, an intergovernmental group, calculates that new patents related to core technologies like batteries, green hydrogen, smart grids, long-term battery storage, and carbon capture will far outpace those and other technologies, including fossil fuels, in the next decade. If you look at some of the trends, they have already shown an incredible promise. Renewable energy costs have fallen manifold, and we have seen their exponential growth. Battery pack prices have fallen almost 90% over the past decade. In order to undertake the clean energy transition to net zero, investments for renewable energy need to triple, and the rate of energy efficiency improvement needs to quadruple. Just take an example of e-mobility. Electrical vehicle sales have accelerated with a growing number of governmental phase-out of internal combustion engines, subsidies to increase EV demand, and car companies themselves embracing the electrical vehicle fleet targets. Recently, Ford declared its commitment to zero carbon emissions by 2050. General Motors has also announced its plan to offer exclusively electrical vehicles by 2035. But they also look at government policies that will be banning in the next decade or two sales of fossil fuel gasoline and petrol cars as well. The example of Tesla, the electric car pioneer, whose market capitalization ballooned from $1.7 billion when it went public in 2010, just a decade ago, to almost around 700 billion recently. This is showing a huge opportunity for those who are braving to go and to leapfrog to cleaner and greener path. Coal phase out is also important in this equation. Coal phase out and coal assets are really becoming a stranded asset soon. For example, in this summer when G20 had their meetings, and of course we're expecting some major announcements from G20 summit soon, 15 countries of the group of G20, except countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, China, and India, all agreed to phase out coal. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, though, announced in September that the country will stop financing coal-powered power stations abroad. The same applies to South Korea, for example, banning participation in the construction, operation, and maintenance of foreign coal-powered projects, which followed Japan's recent tightening of financing criteria for overseas coal-fired power plants. Let's have a look at the consumption and production patterns. If you compare what humanity have been consuming just a few hundred years ago, the consumption has really increased tenfold if you compare to the times of hunter-gatherers and agricultural times and now industrialized times. At the same time, of course, just to compare to 200, 300 years ago, populations had grown 10 times. So this all means that our Mother Earth has to sustain 100 times more consumption by humans compared to a few thousands of years ago. Therefore, the way we develop, the way we do things, the way we conceive development has to be completely different. It has to be a sustainable development. I want to mention that for this major transition to be successful, it has to be the whole of society engagement. This, of course, includes private sector. Government policies has to be very conducive to attracting private sector to low carbon, greener and cleaner investments, recognizing the unavoidable need for net zero emissions. Global companies themselves, one after another, are actually joining the Net for Zero in declaring their commitments to setting the targets for emissions reductions. Tech giants are leading. For example, Apple pledged to achieve zero carbon footprint by 2030 in its supply chain and manufacturing of its production. Google declared its target to achieve zero carbon emissions by 2030, and Microsoft, the software giant, of course, founded by Mr. Gates, which last year vowed to remove all the greenhouse gases it has ever emitted and more by 2050, has set up a $1 billion climate tech fund. Amazon has launched another tech fund, which is worth $2 billion. It will be financed entirely from its balance sheet. We also have seen the news maybe that Amazon has ordered 100,000 vans to help decarbonize its e-commerce delivery fleet. Many more hundreds of companies from all sectors, not only tech, are joining this very meaningful race. There is no longer trade-off between tackling greenhouse gases and making a profit. On the contrary, firms can reduce emissions while earning bigger returns. With the right support, society's transformation could take off in a way previously unimaginable, providing tremendous opportunities, including new job opportunities and creation of whole new industries. It could also provide significant health benefits, for example, through air quality improvements, for having a cleaner and healthier nature and planet. I come from a finance sector. Green Climate Fund, which is set up to support developing countries to leverage finance to leapfrog to climate resilient development and growth, has been actually nurturing the finance innovations that can help both public and private sector and de-risk their investments to leapfrog to greener and cleaner investments. Financial sector has been seeing major changes. Banks, investors, financiers, asset managers, many started aligning their policies and actions, and more they require that companies reflect the risks and opportunities related to climate change in their risk management and decision making. This, of course, also includes ceasing lending to companies that participate in coal or fossil fuel projects. There is a growing realization that the risks and economic costs of climate change have been underestimated, and therefore the net zero pathway requires a significant redirection of global investment flows, and that's globally. At GCF, Green Climate Fund, we use scarce public resources to de-risk frontier projects, as I mentioned, in both public and private sector, and in private sector, crowd in private finance to deploy new climate solutions at scale. We are one of the top providers of blended finance, blended being blending public and private finance. Our business model is to work with our partner organizations, accredited entities that can be international but also domestic, both banks, but it can be also international organizations, it can be also even non-government organizations as well. We also work with recipient countries, and country ownership is key to raise their ambition for climate action through innovative climate finance. We need everyone's action, whether you are in public or private sector, or you work in civil society. And as a Rotarians, we know that you devote a lot of your heart and time and effort in helping to improve the societies. And therefore, I would like to conclude my presentation and my talk with the call to find the right places to intervene, the right solutions that will lead to major changes in the system, in societies, in our countries, that will help those countries to leapfrog and help globally to leapfrog to low carbon, cleaner, greener future. Thank you very much.
Coming up on stage is Dr. James Dorst. Dr. Dorst is the CEO of Rainforest Trust. He's a strategic leader in global conservation with a passion for saving wildlife and wildlands and a talent for translating cutting-edge science into field projects with maximum conservation impact. With his previous work with the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation and the Wildlife Conservation Society, he worked extensively in protecting wildlife and biodiversity. All over the world, he launched program-based intervention that enjoined multiple sectors of society for outcomes like the Great Elephant Census, combating the trade and trafficking of endangered species and wildlife, closing ivory markets, saving sharks, saving coral reefs in Congo Basin. And on top of his main line of work, he founded the Tropical Biology Association, was founding chair of the boards of AIDSPAN and Community Markets for Conservation. He was also the CEO of Crusade, the UK's national fundraiser for HIV or AIDS, helping make life-saving treatments available in the UK and Africa. A New Yorker, Dr. Deutsch was educated at Harvard and Cambridge. The Rainforest Trust is a widely known non-profit supporting large-scale rainforest conservation and endangered species protection programs. Leaders of Asia Pacific, please welcome on stage Dr. James Dorst.
Over millennia, the world's tropical forests have become the planet's storehouse of biodiversity. Rainforests have also been capturing carbon, creating our weather, quenching our thirst, sustaining cultures and livelihoods. They've seen civilizations come and go, until ours. In little more than a generation, we have taken from the forest at a rate far faster than it can replenish. Species have disappeared, rivers have dried up, cultures have been lost, carbon released, our planet has warmed. In 1988, Rainforest Trust was founded with a mission to save species, protect our planet, and support communities by protecting tropical forests. In the 33 years since, we have built 90 partnerships, invested $170 million, saving vital habitat. With our partners on the ground, we have protected more than 37 million acres, safeguarded 1,293 threatened species, locked up over 13 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalents. But it's not enough. We need to do more to stop the code red for humanity, to save all species, including our own. Rainforest Trust is pledging to do more, to double match our past work. By 2030, we plan to invest $500 million to protect 250 million acres, to safeguard half of all threatened bird and mammal species, to lock up 30 billion metric tons of carbon, for people, for species, for our planet.
Thank you so much to members of the Rotary for inviting me to speak here today. I think I don't need to tell you that the world faces 3 interlinked crises: climate change, the loss of biodiversity, that is species and ecosystems and the services they provide to people, and health, the COVID pandemic. But it may surprise you if I say that all 3 of these are symptoms of a broken relationship between our species and the rest of the natural world. You may also know that this year is a critical year for turning the tide on each of these. Once every 10 years, the nations of the world come together to set the conservation agenda, the nature agenda, the biodiversity agenda for the next 10 years. And that is happening now. The first part of the conference completed in October in Kunming, China, and the second half continues in May next year. At the same time, you probably also know that the nations of the world met recently in Glasgow to chart the course against climate change. Why are these 2 conferences so critical for the future of nature? Interestingly, it's all about the number 30. At the Biodiversity Conference, which reconvenes in May, we need all the nations of the world to agree to set aside 30% of the Earth's land and 30% of the Earth's waters for nature, as national parks, protected areas, or as lands and seas stewarded by local and indigenous people. Because the greatest cause of biodiversity loss is habitat destruction. This single act of expanding protected areas is the most important thing we can do to reset our relationship with nature and end extinctions. At the climate conference, many voices called for 30% of our climate change effort, including 30% of the money to address climate change, to go to so-called nature-based solutions to climate change, such as saving and restoring forests that can suck carbon out of the air and sequester it permanently in soils. Those are big global ambitions and agendas. But how do we bring them down to earth? How do we connect them to things that you or I can do and to work right here in the Philippines or Taiwan? Let me tell you a little bit about my organization and about some of our partners in Asia. Rainforest Trust is a global nonprofit organization that raises money, mostly from concerned private individuals, but also from some companies, and passes on those funds to local organizations in the tropical developing world. And each of those grants is for a project which will protect rainforests, and other habitats critical for both biodiversity and climate change mitigation. Since our founding in 1988, we and our partners on the ground have protected or are in the process of protecting 70 million acres. That is an area almost the size of the land area of the Philippines. But given the extraordinary urgency of the biodiversity and climate crises, that is not fast enough. So we are pledging to double down on our mission, and by the end of 2025, to bring that total to 150 million acres. That 150 million acres will provide a home for half of all the threatened bird and mammal species on Earth and store as much CO2 as the entire US economy produces in 4 years. To do all of that, we are pledging over the next 10 years to raise and grant out to local organizations $500 million. That pledge has already helped to inspire other private funders to join us. You may have heard that just back in September, at the opening of the UN General Assembly, 8 organizations joined with Rainforest Trust to pledge $5 billion over 10 years to expand protected areas and save nature. All of that funding will go directly to support the 30 by 30 agenda. But once again, let me bring that back down to earth. Some of our very best partners implementing work with these funds are right here in the Philippines. The Katala Foundation. With them, we have established protected areas for the critically endangered Palawan forest turtles. Green Mindanao. With these guys, we have established a reserve on Dinagat Island. And now, if you'll excuse my pronunciation, Daluhe Daloy Ngbuhe, with whom we have established the San Luis Ispacal Isui Indigenous Community Area. And most especially, the extraordinary young women of the Center for Sustainability in Palawan. They have already established the Cleopatra's Needle Reserve, and they are well underway to protecting Kensad Mountain. You may not realize that nowhere on Earth is more important for the fight against biodiversity loss and climate change than right here in the Philippines. So if you would like to know more or to support this work, we really encourage you to contact these organizations directly. I know that they would deeply appreciate any assistance that you can provide. Or if you prefer, you can support this agenda globally and projects like these all across the tropics through my organization, Rainforest Trust. We would also be deeply grateful. However you decide to act, I thank you for attending this important conference, for everything you do through Rotary, and for kindly welcoming me to join you here today.
Coming up on stage is Dr. Janet Cabiberry Macarrea. Dr. Janet is the head of the Gender and Social Safeguards Unit and is the Senior Gender Advisor of the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP, headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Janet is a mother of 2 and is a Kenyan with a career spanning 30 years in academia and non-governmental and international development organizations. Her primary focus has been the promotion of gender equality, women empowerment, and children's rights. Dr. Janet holds a PhD in law from the University of Warwick, a Master of Laws from Columbia University, a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Nairobi, and a diploma in women's law. She has extensively published books and articles in referred journals in various areas with a particular focus on gender issues, children's rights, women's human rights, law and development, and environmental law. Dr. Janet is also a dedicated Rotarian and gives her services and time to help improve the lives of the less fortunate. She is a past president of the Rotary Club of Karura in Nairobi, Kenya, and is the current District Programs Committee Chair for District 9212 that covers Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and South Sudan. Leaders of Asia Pacific, please welcome on stage Dr. Janet Kaviberry Macharia.
Jumbo to all the participants and leaders attending this conference. I'm joining you from Nairobi, Kenya, and I'm happy to be with you today. My presentation will focus on building sustainable and equitable use of the environment to combat climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss in the Asia and the Pacific region. First, I will give you an overview of my presentation. I will start by presenting the global environmental challenges and the recent global commitments to protect the environment. Thereafter, I will address the impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution in Asia and the Pacific region. After that, I will address the gender-differentiated impacts of environmental degradation, and thereafter, I'll talk about the support to the youth. In conclusion, I will give a call for integrative action by Rotary clubs in the Asia and Pacific region. Looking at the global environmental challenges, I wish to introduce you to a recent UNEP report titled Making Peace with Nature, a scientific blueprint to tackle climate, biodiversity, and pollution emergencies. This report states that climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution add up to 3 self-inflicted planetary crises that are closely interconnected and put the well-being of current and future generations at an acceptable risk. The impact of this triple planetary crisis is, on the one hand, deepening human poverty as the poorer populations that are mostly natural resource dependent become poorer. And on the other hand, it's perpetuating the continuous ecological degradation resulting in natural and climate-related disasters. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, estimates that global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade between 2030 and 2052. According to the World Health Organization, 24% of all global deaths, roughly 13.7 million deaths a year, are linked to the environment due to risks such as air pollution and chemical exposure. Recent global commitments to protect environment include, in October 2021, the United Nations Human Rights Council recently adopted Resolution 4813, which states that having a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right. This will require bold action to ensure this resolution serves as a springboard to push for transformative economic, social, and environmental policies that will protect people and nature. This new resolution acknowledges the damage inflicted by climate change and environmental destruction on millions of people across the world. It also underlines that the most vulnerable segments of the population are more acutely impacted. Going to the 2030 Agenda, in the preamble to the 2030 Agenda, world leaders affirmed that they are determined to protect the planet from degradation, including through sustainable consumption and production, sustainably managing its natural resources, and taking urgent action on climate change so that it can support the needs of the present. Out of the 17 goals of the SDGs, there are 6 goals, and these are namely Goal 6, Goal 8, Goal 12, Goal 14, Goal 15, and Goal 17, which address environmental management. Going to the examples of impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution in the Asia and Pacific region, I will address this in terms of looking at climate change, the biodiversity loss, and pollution, and give you examples. Firstly, when we look at climate change-related disasters, we know that in 2019, More than 94.2 million people in Asia and the Pacific were affected by climate-related disasters. And this is according to a latest IFRC World Disasters Report. This includes increased cyclone intensity and extreme rainfall, resulting in severe and deadly flooding. For example, the damage caused by the supercyclonic storm Amphan at the Bay of Bengal in May 2020 cost $13.7 billion US. Rises in surface temperature have led to increased dust storms, droughts, and heat waves in the arid regions. And in the years between 2035 to 2100, worst droughts are projected to increase by 1.5 times. Asia and the Pacific region lost more than USD 1.5 trillion between 1970 and 2019 due to the impact of disasters. When you look at reduced forest cover, the IPCC has pointed out that climate change is expected to deteriorate the status of tropical forest ecosystems. And yet, on the other hand, forest conservation is a top priority in combating climate change. Between 1990 and 2015, Southeast Asia showed a 12.9% reduction in forest cover, largely due to an increase in timber extraction, large-scale biofuel plantations, and the expansion of intensive agriculture and shrimp farms. Biofuels are a major energy source in the region, 15% of the total primary energy supply, which is increasing the demand for arable land and worsening deforestation. Conversion of forests for large-scale palm oil plantations and heavy commercial logging has further degraded existing grasslands, further contributing to the decline in wild mammals and birds across the region. When looking at climate-related migration and displacement, we know that the impacts of the current climate crisis, including rapid onset disasters like flooding or hurricanes, or slow onset disasters such as drought or sea level rise, are expected to extensively change the patterns of human settlement as people move away from unfavorable environmental conditions that threaten traditional livelihoods or personal security. It is estimated that in Southeast Asia, we will see 40 million internal climate migrants by 2050. Plastic pollution and waste. Increased unsustainable production and consumption levels in the Asia-Pacific region has resulted in high levels of pollution. This includes air pollution, water pollution, and land pollution. By 2030, the region could be generating 1.4 billion tons of municipal solid waste per year, most of which will end up in a landfill or leak into the environment. Asia has largely driven the growth in plastic production over the past decades, contributing nearly half of global plastic production, and it consumes 38% of the world's plastic, making the region the leading consumer in plastic products. The cost of marine litter to economies in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation region is estimated to be $11 million per year. Going back to plastic pollution and waste, 95% of the global riverine plastic emissions discharged into the seas comes from only 10 rivers, 8 of which are in Asia. Amongst the 8 are the Mekong and the Ganges rivers, the lifeblood for hundreds of millions of people in Southeast Asia and India. Since 2017, 63 countries, both coastal and landlocked, have joined the UNEP Clean Seas campaign with ambitious pledges and important commitments to prevent marine litter and plastic pollution, especially from the land-based sources through lakes, rivers, and waterways. The commitments made since 2017 are as follows. Australia made a commitment that 100% of its packaging will be reusable, compostable, or recyclable by 2025. 70% will be recycled or composted by 2025, and phasing out of single-use packaging will begin. Indonesia, on the other hand, committed to reduce plastic waste by 70% by the year 2025. New Zealand committed to ban products containing plastic microbeads and is now developing options to get rid of single-use plastic bags. The Philippines also committed to draw up or adopt national plans and legislation to combat marine litter. India committed to curb the use of single-use plastic by 2022 and has also pledged to establish a national and regional marine litter action campaign. Sri Lanka committed to implement a ban on single-use plastic products and short-term plastics from March 2021. It would also step up separation and recycling of waste and make its oceans and coastlands pollution-free by the year 2030. When we look at air pollution, we see that every year an estimated 6 to 7 million people die prematurely because of exposure to air pollution, 70% of which occur in the Asia and Pacific region. Over 90% of the people in the world are estimated to breathe polluted air, with the worst air pollution levels in the Eastern Mediterranean region and Southeast Asia. In Asia and the Pacific, about 4 billion people, who make up 92% of the region's population, are exposed to levels of air pollution that pose a significant risk to their health, and this also includes indoor air pollution. Emissions from motor vehicles, fossil fuel power plants, industrial activities, slash and burn agriculture, deforestation, and many other activities in both urban and rural areas make it impossible for many people today to avoid air pollution. We'll now just have a quick look at the impact of COVID-19 in addressing environmental management in the Asia-Pacific region. The health and economic and social impacts of COVID-19 across Asia and the Pacific region have been varied. The World Bank has estimated that the East Asia and Pacific region could see at least 11 million more people falling into poverty this year due to the impacts of the pandemic. The Forum of Ministers and Environment Authorities of Asia and Pacific met in October this year in South Korea and noted in their discussions that while the COVID-19 pandemic had hampered the capacity of Asian countries to respond to the planetary crisis, it also offers unprecedented opportunity to build back better. In particular, government policies in response to COVID-19 can reinforce linkages between human well-being, creation of green jobs, and the health of ecosystems. That developing countries require support to transition to greener, more sustainable development pathways post-COVID. There is a need to prioritize sustainable ocean management and a coordinated and global response to halt biodiversity loss, marine litter, and plastics pollution. Much of the decline that our environment faces is reversible, but this requires bold, courageous decisions. The cost of inaction is too high a price to pay, especially for future generations. Now, going into the gender-differentiated impacts of environmental degradation, we start by looking at the gender-differentiated impacts of environmental degradation with a focus on climate change. We look at emerging climate change hazards. These are droughts, sea level rise, extreme weather events, and warmer temperatures. This certainly will expose men and women to new risks or exacerbate existing challenges. However, this also leads to insecurity at multiple levels, at the household, at the community, at state level, and certainly at interstate and cross-border levels. And all of this can undermine women and men's ability to adapt and prevent or recover from climate-related risks. When you look at the gender-differentiated impacts of environmental degradation biodiversity, we know from studies that 55% of the households in the Asia-Pacific region rely on firewood for cooking collection, and this is mostly done by girls. Women can spend up to 9 to 15 hours collecting 28 to 34 kgs of bundles of wood. Women also lead water collection management. And in Nepal, for example, women contribute to up to 70% of the labor required for water management. Environmental degradation leads to water scarcity and increased levels of deforestation, further increasing the levels of physically draining work for women that they must endure. 70% of farmers are women, and yet they are often overlooked by society and the state, and almost all existing water management policies are gender blind. when you go to looking at the differentiated impacts of environmental degradation with regard to pollution, we see that the impact of environmental quality, exposure to pollution and hazardous chemicals is different between men and women, and this is also based upon the gendered household and occupational roles. In low-income countries, women, to a larger greater extent, are exposed to indoor air pollution arising from solid fuel use such as burning firewood for cooking. According to the World Health Organization, this kills 4.3 million people every year. Some personal care and cosmetic products contain harmful microplastics, which could be absorbed through the skin, mouth, and nose, potentially damaging human cells and causing allergic reactions. As these items are largely used by women, they are more vulnerable to the effects of this exposure. In Vietnam, for example, 90% of the street waste collectors and scavengers are women who live and work under dangerous and unhealthy environmental conditions and also suffer from extreme poverty and discrimination. Looking at the costs and opportunities for gender and pollution, we have a table in front of us which outlines the different costs. For example, 7 million people die from air pollution every year. But then when we go further, we see that 80% of wastewater enters the environment with no proper treatment. Again, 65 million people die from exposure to hazardous substances every year, and 80 countries are substantially affected by land degradation and soil pollution. Thereafter, we look at what this means when we look at women and what options there are for women. In terms of the opportunities for women, women who have access to clean energy and electricity engage in more economic activities that are essential for gender empowerment, social equity, poverty reduction, and environmental sustainability. When women control additional income, they spend more of it than men do on food, health, clothing, and education for their children. This has positive implications for immediate well-being and capital formation and economic growth. And this table goes on to look at the different gendered aspects. Support to youth. The UN Environment Programme has come up with a global environmental outlook for the youth. As of 2019, there are approximately 1.2 billion young people in the world between the ages of 15 and 24 years. They account for about 16% of the global population. These young people are in an important position to understand and help solve the environmental problems around us. The Global Environment Outlook 6 for youth is a one-stop shop for young persons to understand the state of the environment, what they can do every day to drive markets to adopt environmentally sustainable products and services, and how to develop their skills and choose environmentally sustainable careers, bearing in mind that by the year 2030, youth from Africa and Asia will make up 77% of the world's youth labor force. The GEO6 has been prepared by the UN Environment Programme, and it was prepared together with 25 youth leaders from all over the world who are the authors for the report. The youth for the last 3 years have been very, very active in calling upon action with respect to climate change. And here in front of us, you see a rally of youth in Singapore where they are calling for action. And one of the things you can see in the picture is a call for system change. And they have another poster talking about we want climate justice. And this is something that has been going on across the world. The youth have become very, very vocal on action on climate change. Lastly, a call for action by Rotary clubs. Rotary International has taken supporting the environment as its seventh area of focus. Rotary International is committed to supporting activities that strengthen the conservation and protection of natural resources, advance ecological sustainability, and foster harmony between communities and the environment. There are a number of actions that have been listed out that Rotary clubs the world over can undertake. These include protecting and restoring land, coastal, marine, and freshwater resources, enhancing the capacity of communities to support natural resource management and conservation, addressing the cause of climate change by reducing the emission of greenhouse gases, strengthening ecosystems and communities affected by climate change, and lastly, advocating for sustainable consumption to build an economy that uses resources more efficiently. The call for action to especially address plastic pollution, a call is made out to join the End Plastic Soup campaign. The End Plastic Soup campaign is a global initiative of 800 Rotary and Rotaract clubs worldwide, and it's also supported by 3,500 Rotarians. And the aim is to solve the global plastic problem by working with all the 1.2 million Rotarians to act to beat plastic pollution. This is an initiative that was started by the Rotary clubs of Amsterdam. The End Plastic Soup's goal is that by 2050, there will be no more plastic soup in the oceans, seas, and no more plastic waste in our lakes, rivers, forests, parks, and streets. Rotary clubs worldwide will work together to solve the plastic waste problem. Communities are encouraged to recycle plastics to generate an income. Rotary clubs from the 100 districts in the Asia-Pacific region are invited to join this campaign. Call for action with respect to reducing plastic waste. One of the activities that Rotary clubs can undertake is to create awareness on the hazards of plastics and chemicals to humans and the environment. You can also hold joint events that are geared towards environmental conservation and also undertake cleanup of rivers and the coastal areas. You need to involve younger generation and school-going children on sustainable consumption habits. And the picture that you're seeing in this slide is of young children cleaning up the Mekong Delta Basin. Another call for action is that of afforestation. Rotary clubs can support afforestation efforts in communities to increase the tree cover. There are activities which have already been undertaken by the district I belong to, that is Rotary District 9212, and these include supporting school greening programs in the district where each school grows a set number of trees, some of which are fruit trees. This also includes setting up environment clubs in the schools and also tree planting along urban roads and highways, in police stations and in hospitals. And this will contribute towards increasing the tree cover. Another call for action is that of conserving our forests. Protecting our forests from destruction by working with community-based forest associations is one activity that can be undertaken. This will provide small-scale participatory forest management. It will also utilize indigenous knowledge of forest protection and maintenance. We can also carry out a campaign to all Rotary clubs to start their own tree nurseries to support tree planting projects. In this way, the clubs will always have a supply of tree seedlings to plant when the tree planting season starts. You also may undertake a needs assessment of introduction of agroforestry to communities, and in this case, provide seedlings to farmers and support them for maintenance. In conclusion, I have some parting words for you. Firstly, we urgently need to use our environment in ways that sustain the livelihoods of the present and future well-being of all. Secondly, to reduce the uneven burden of negative environmental impacts, transformative action is needed in all areas to empower women and to advance gender equality and to build stronger communities. Lastly, to prevent and reverse the negative impacts of environmental degradation will require concerted efforts of everyone, including governments, businesses, and people around the world. Rotary clubs the world over have a key role to play in this regard. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I wish you a most enjoyable conference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Janet, and thank you again to Dr. Oyun and Dr. James. It's now time to go into the breakout sessions. You can choose any one of the 5 laid out for you. Just click on the button that takes you to the specific session you wish to attend. After your breakout session, we'll get together again here at the plenary hall to synthesize the environment for good arc. See you later. Enjoy the breakout sessions.